this I'm so happy that I can speak to someone who knows the language. So like you do you know you've had cessations?
Yeah, well, I had one. Yeah, well, I posted about it on Facebook. I don't know if you saw my post. Just recently, I made a post about it. It's like the ninth jhana or the ninth yana.
When I heard about jhanas, I was so happy because I was like, oh, like there's a map for this shit. Because I realized like I'm experiencing at least up to the fourth jhana regularly. You know,
Mhm.
before a deep meditation, there's all this relaxation in the body, and then the mind gets really still, and then there's just this equanimity. And then from that space, like I don't know what jhanas I've tasted, but like you know, I can empathize a little bit with the qualities of timeless or space and infinite space, infinite consciousness, and then there's the cessation or whatever.
Yeah. Well,
Um, but I feel like a cessation is undeniable, and I don't know. I don't think I've had a cessation.
okay. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it is pretty obvious. Yeah, I had one not too long ago, maybe a couple months ago. I usually, if I really focus on meditative practices, I could get there pretty, yeah, like pretty consistently. I feel like if I were to really get back into it, it just hasn't been like as much of a focus. But and also because I don't know, it's interesting. Like, okay, so I was doing some research on it because there's some really good forums actually, because Buddhism is a lot more popular, right? So you can get into some pretty nice conversations on Buddhist forums about these topics because there are like everyday Joes or people that know actually a decent amount about it. And I remember finding this one forum and I copied and pasted a decent amount of the stuff. I'll see if I can find it. And basically there was a couple pieces in there that really stood out to me because like like day to day, I've talked about it before where like kind of like the three dantians are, it's related to the Yumbe, the heart or the Azare point, and then the Rajna with the Keylontic system, where those three main points, you can usually feel those currents running when you start to activate them consistently. So for me, it would be like that radiance in the heart of the Azare that was like constantly kind of beaming. And when I get into those deeper states, that kind of like glow starts to like consume me, where it's like it's there, I'm not getting to a cessation level, but I'm not even really attempting to get there because like the expansiveness of the bliss is so beautiful and so joyful and so nice that I don't need to do anything else from that place. But there's kind of like a paralysis that starts to come in there where it's just like this pure consciousness. And so the cessation, yeah, is kind of a bit different. That like when they outline like there literally being kind of like nothing there, or like you kind of just like flash in, flash out, sometimes for a moment, but sometimes for longer. That's been my like experience of it. And one of the breakdowns in the forum was this guy was talking about like the afterglow, where it can last for quite a long period after, and make things like very unpractical in terms of like walking reality. And it was like really well explained in the terms of how like, yeah, and Frank talks about this a lot too, how, Ramaji kind of did too, where like enlightenment and real and walking human life on some level they're together, but on another level they're kind of completely unrelated. Like if you were to experience a cessation and experience that afterglow, it doesn't make you like this, like, I don't know, like magical manifester or being able to like be a peak performer in life or something. Like if anything, it actually makes you a bit of a potato. Like you're kind of like knocked out almost for a little while because it's so beautiful, so peaceful that you don't care to do anything actually within the modern, like,
Right, right.
right. So I was like, it was like making me think in terms of, yeah, like really separating the practicalities of things, like if I'm just like blissing out in these states all day for most days, yeah, I'm most definitely not going to make that much money or not really be engaged. And that could be a belief too, but when I really look at the practicalities, it's just really simple. Like I won't even move. So like,
Well, it's kind of like greatly demystifying, right? Like
yeah.
I just like I don't even feel called to like go into every nuance, but there's all these beliefs about like what it is. But it's like once any form of it starts precipitating, it's like it's just another, I don't know, it's almost like just another thing,
Yeah,
but paradoxically it's interwoven into your experience of everything.
that's it. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, post Rasa, it was very clear to me that like that whatever everyone was talking about was very clearly there. But past 5 years, like a lot has also still changed. Like there's been firstly, it like the depth of equanimity and peacefulness is just more ever present than it was many years ago. There's just a natural ease and joyfulness in relationships and interactions, and it's just ever deepening. You know, ethical morality and virtues that also comes more online. Like all these
Oh
things
wait,
kind of go ahead.
there's a couple things that I'm wanting to reference just because like you know the language, and there was there's those three pillars that I was thinking of in relation to the three dantians, but there's morality, wisdom, and then there's another one, but I forget what it is.
Yeah. Well, in typical teachings, like even some of the non-dualists talk about it, where it's like you're basically awakening the head, awakening the heart, awakening the gut. And I know,
Yeah.
right? Like Adyashanti has talked about. There's quite a few of them that reference similar, and yeah, it's pretty accurate.
I resonate because there's something that Frank said too. There's a couple of things that Frank said that I want to just bounce off you 'cause I'm curious your experience with them. But I feel like there's an awakening of my gut going on. I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's happening in some level. And it feels like I'm dying. And it feels like
Mm-hmm.
I'll die if he says it feels like you'll die if you let go. And if you don't let go, you're gonna die too.
Mm,
So like I've been placed in that situation like really strongly for this year, like that feeling, it's just like death is just imminent, like on a level I can't even understand. Just like my identity is just dissolving, don't
mm,
understand what's happening. Um, so there's that, and then there's this concept of unilocality that I'm super interested by, and I was like really intentionally exploring for a couple hours one day, where I got really into some self inquiry and just I was able to track like it's almost like when I would say who's experiencing this, I would be able to track like a perception of like where I just asked that question from, and then that kind of just compounded until I was like I don't even know how to describe what I experienced. Um, but it gave me the glimpse into like okay, like what is this, and what's your experience with this concept of non-localization, and he speaks about it often, right? And all his videos are like all like woo, woo.
yeah. Well, on the first note about the dying, there's a couple of notes that come to mind. Firstly, there was another woman that I that ended up getting and going through the whole rasa process, and then she was going through like 2 years, 3 years of kind of similar to what you were, almost like the way she said it was like almost like she bit off more than she could chew. She felt like it was too much. She wanted to go back in time and reverse it because she didn't want what was happening to her, which was essentially what you're describing, like a really painful feeling in the solar plexus, where it was like, or solar plexus and like sacral, where it was like a knot undoing, and that knot that was undoing was like she felt like her impending like ego death essentially, and
Yeah,
she didn't want to let it go, like even though she knew that if she kept piercing through it she would dissolve it, but she was afraid to dissolve it because she didn't want her identity to go with it. So she was like fighting it and fighting to keep herself alive, and like she was asking me the same questions almost like every day, like relentlessly, like am I going to be able to do normal things, like am I going to be able to like things or not, like
oh
you know
yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead.
well I just because like I guess this is part of the conversation that I wanted to kind of say too is like that's happening, and then simultaneously there's a real need to like have some form of an ego present in this world. And sometimes I like I trip up a little bit about like you know um the kind of annihilation, just like that annihilation of self.
Mm,
And then like okay, well like what do like I you know what do I say, what do I do, what's okay to do, what's okay to say, and really it kind of takes me away from like anything really anyone else says, or
mm, mm.
it's just do what feels right,
Yeah,
meet the
yeah.
middle way. But
Yeah,
I,
literally.
I felt I felt called to mention that, just the concept of like ego dissolution, but then the feeling of like a path for someone less like myself. It's not like I have a stable foundation that's being dissolved. It's like there's nothing there to begin with.
Well,
It's reaching down into my family now. That's the only place it could go.
oh my God. I mean, yeah, like it's kind of similar. It was similar for her too, in the regards of like, yeah, I mean, for all of us really, because we were so devoted, so focused on this path. There's really nothing else. Like we don't have another life or another thing to look at. You know what I mean? But that's part of like I feel what not the regret, but I think that's kind of what people feel like whenever they, come to these levels and then want to like embody their life again. It's not actually a part of the path to embody your life again, other than the sense of you just realizing that there was nothing wrong with your life to begin with. So everything that you wanted to go back to is like you're going back to it because that's just a part of your natural path that potentially you were running from in the name of spirituality. And then after you come full circle, you come back into the world. That's actually illustrated in a Zen illustration. It's a famous Zen illustration. I think it's like the ox or something, but it's basically like outlining the path of the being who goes off and like realizes and becomes enlightened and then comes back into the mundane, and like it's a return to the world. It's the same in the hero's journey, and Ramaji outlined it in his book too, where he outlined this whole element of like where you come back into the world because you realize there's actually nothing wrong with the world. There was never nothing wrong with the world, and everything a part of your natural unfolding path of things just naturally that were always there in your life that in the name of spirituality we may have like shunned. It like reappears because it's like this is just your karma, like it's you know what I mean?
Spiritual
So
ego and being with family, bro.
yeah yeah,
Revealing. But please continue.
no, tell us more, bro. That's exactly it.
Well, I mean, it's just I feel like it's just pretty self-explanatory, right? Like
Yeah,
when the mundane nature of your family's back around, and you're interacting with these people that you love and care about, and you just, especially when you've lived a lifestyle like someone like me, where just been out around hippie people, nomadic, you notice all these like operating systems, little beliefs that you're like, yeah, like that's kind of bullshit. You're right, Dad.
yeah,
Or you might not be as blunt as that, but there's just I don't know,
yeah. No, I totally understand. I mean, it's
when
all
you
in
see these
balance, like
concepts.
because yeah, no, I totally get it. I think it's again, it's that middle way, right? Where like everything is a like if we look at everything as this perpetual balancing act back to the reality of the middle way. The middle way was the first teaching of the Buddha because it's the most important, and it's basically like at any point that you push into any direction you'll be pushed back into the opposite direction. So like you basically every attempt to try and crystallize anything, like, oh, I love this new show now, and then you watch a million show episodes of it and then you realize, wait a minute, I just binged and I need to stop binging for a couple of weeks, or like simple things like that. Or a food, like you get back on a food that you haven't eaten and then you eat too much of it and you're like, wait a minute, I don't need to eat 10 of these things, I can eat 2 of these things, instead of eating none of these things. Like it's just like this perpetual, and that's what I'm constantly reminded of. Like anything that happens in our life where it becomes a crystallized identity in the form of, oh, I want this or I don't want this thing, or I want this thing now, and then you keep going or you keep going, you're just you're constantly brought back. And that's essentially like going back to the second point. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to reference another thing that Frank said that I liked a lot. It was just a different perspective from, sometimes people like following signs and the angels and guided synchronicity, synchronicity, and all that, which is a real thing that I kind of think about often. But yeah, Frank was just like, yeah, I just did my formal meditation practice 2 hours every day and just kind of let my character do what he wanted. And you can
Yeah,
really see that on his channel. Like he was doing some fucking random ass shit. Like I saw some crazy videos of him. But yeah, you just let the character kind of live its life as normal, and you just continue. You have that dedicated time for inquiry or whatever.
exactly. Well, I was referring to this the other day in a live stream 2 days ago that I did with the Zoom call, and I was basically saying like, if you have this conceptual idea of final enlightenment in your head and you're too attached to it, everything in your life becomes like some means to enlightenment. Like you think, right? Like every single thing you do, you're basically like putting it on the litmus test of whether or not it's going to make you more enlightened or not. And so you become neurotic, it's like it's a neurosis, and it's another addiction. It's just another
Jhana
addiction.
junkie, bro. I think I'm a Jhana junkie anonymous. I think I need to go, bro. Like I'm like, I think I'm a Jhana junkie. Like I equate peak experiences to something in my head, right? It's like maybe
Yeah.
that's maybe there's a different awareness that I can cultivate that is beyond even what I think is beyond.
That's it. I mean, another way to look at it in an even simpler way is like the addiction to something new, which is the same thing. Like the peak experience addiction is like something new, something new, something new. And I was relating this actually coming back to the music. For me, it wasn't necessarily just music. It was just like around the center point of some of my talents or not talents, but skill sets that if I think about, if I just do these basic skill sets and provide them day in, day out, like I'll never go without any abundance or money or any resource I ever need, because like for me, it's like simple teachings or simple meditations, some music elements, but just simple aspects of my skill set that I've fostered for like over 10 years now, that it comes so naturally that in the seeking of new talents and new skills, I look past the fact that I could literally just teach meditation every day for the next 10 years. And it could be world-class level stuff that will provide for everyone, And this is the same thing that came up with Fiona and her cello. Like she's basically now in the space where she's just had to like choose cello. Like I'm choosing cello as an avenue that I'm going to focus on. And all of a sudden, like all these clear avenues of like, literally, if you just sit down and record for 2 hours, you're going to find all this world-class little stuff that you could put into songs and release. And I was thinking about you in the same way with like that 10-minute thing you sent, and probably other styles of music that you do. But like, as you hone in on it, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is what you've been focused on for 10 years, or whatever period. That is just, it's not new. Like, it's not this like new thing every day, but it's just like so simple that you just could do. And that's it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, oh, there you go. Like all.
And that's it. That's it.
And that's that's kind of how the enlightenment process is, right? It's kind of like that, where when as it happens or as it deepens, you realize like, oh yeah, like it's just this eternal process. Like it doesn't need to be this like new thing every day, because it's such a long, like eternal journey that
Yeah.
like I could just be okay with what's right here, and that's a lot of what Frank in specific refers to as, like when you're talking about like no location type thing, his description of things arising on their own with their own center point, like, okay, if a bird tweets, it's not like me observing the bird, it's just the bird tweeting, and it arises and collapses on its own. It's God arising as itself and collapsing, and there is a co-creative like interplay that's happening, but there isn't necessarily just this like awareness that's observing this bird tweeting at a distance, and I'm over here and the bird's over here. His description of that, he's described it in more detail than that. It's very accurate to what I've experienced, in the sense that yeah, like everything is kind of just happening and arising and collapsing on its own, and it is absolutely God source arising and collapsing on its own, and it's felt in that way, but there's nothing really to it. Like there's nothing you can really describe about it, because the moment you try, it's kind of like it's already almost dissolving, and at the same time, there is still an individuation. I've been really adamant with the whole non-dual community about this whole like driving home of no self, because what the non-dual community is so adamant about no self is they're describing a true reality, that yes, there is no self as the self that you believed yourself to be, but there is a 100% a self that you individually experience that is different than the self like you'll experience, because
Right.
it's
I've been hearing about. Please continue.
yeah. Well, basically, like the way I see the no self teaching, because okay, I told Frank this when he was going through what I view to be a bit of the honeymoon phase after those levels of awakening, where he was like, and I see it everywhere, and it was in myself too, where you get kind of excited, and then you're really hammering home some core non-dual teachings, but in doing that, you actually start to like flip-flop a little bit on one side of the coin, because you're attempting to really hammer home what you've now just newly realized, but as it matures, it bounce out again, because it's not just him. There's quite a few other like young people on sharing non-duality on YouTube right now. Like there's a couple of them, and a lot of them are really hammering home this whole like no self, there's nothing you can do, you're already, it's like all the kind of same stuff, and it's accurate. But it becomes too crystallized on that idea, because my experience of the no self is, yeah, sure, the self I had thought myself to be is like dissolved, or it had like gone through a process of dissolution. But then the truest identity of myself, like coming from the avatar rishi levels, is what I actually feel every day, embodying more and more and more. Like it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And I do feel like the individuation of my own being, as much as I do experience that whole like absolute everything arising, you know what I mean?
I really like that point, and I really enjoy talking with you about this stuff, because there's such like a overlap of certain things that even like it's hard to find an overlap like that,
Yeah.
because yeah, even just the fact that you said Rishi Body and Frank Yang in the same sentence is really cool to me. Because I also feel that too, like especially in the music, and like, you know, like there's some kind of intimacy between me and whatever, you know, avatar self or evolved version of, you know, my meat suit and my consciousness.
Yeah. And
And I feel like that's important. At least it's been important in my life. And then when I approach something like those really Eastern teachings, it kind of just labels that as another sensation, which isn't inaccurate, but I don't know. Like there's more mystery to it, I think.
yeah, well, actually, I'm gonna send you because I just remembered this really good excerpt from I think it's Sliders 9, but it's basically called The Teachings of the Christ Buddha, or the Christ Buddha, and it's basically her outlining what I've shown you this before, like the stages of what they view to be like the levels of Buddhism that's currently available, and then the higher Christ Buddha teachings, which have never been available on planet, or were rarely available. So
Of course you got this next level shit, bro.
well, I can't.
Of course you're about to pull out, oh bro, there's more levels to Buddhism. Oh, beyond the cessation, what? The regenesis.
Well, it's wild, because when you hear like any of these teachings from like even the Buddha, like Ramaji, Ramana, like Frank, you know, you hear them all speak similarly about the absolute. Like there's no further you can go, in the sense that like when you have a cessation, it would only make sense that there's no further you can go, because it's a complete like it feels like an end of everything, right? But no beginning. Like it's so difficult to describe. So when they're describing this idea that they like, even with Ramaji, when I would ask him, okay, what's beyond 1,000, he acknowledged that there could be a possibility of something beyond 1,000, but he didn't even want to go there. And I understand why. And I understand the same reason why Frank and anyone else would say that, okay, this is the end and this is the final enlightenment or whatever, even though that's not really what they're saying, is because it does, like, on some level feel like, well, yeah, this is it. Like, so if this is it, then that's it. That's enlightenment. But in the same sense, you could say, okay, this is it, but it's also now a beginning of a new video game. And we actually talked about that directly in chat, me and him, where I told him like the way I experience it, it's like the beginning of eternity. And he was like, yeah, that's basically what I see too. So it's like, it's an interesting paradox, right? Because from the Chris Buddha, like Keylontic teachings, they were basically outlining that nirvana from the Buddha system, which is essentially the highest stage, is level 2 out of 5. It's like you're basically awakening the into the oversoul or something like that. You've awakened into the oversoul level. So that's what the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Mahayana paths of Vajrayana Buddhism would basically bring you to. And so the distortion elements that they identified, that Ashiana was talking about, was specifically the no self idea, where you just go into nothingness. She basically said it exactly how we're talking about it. She said it like the aspect of nothingness that was described in Buddhism was essentially the death of the ego, where you feel like it's a death. Yes, like you're dissolving this old identity or this false identity, but
Emptiness, nothingness, all those things.
yeah, so that's the death part, but that is the opening for the higher identity climb, so that the avatar rishi embodiment that eventually would happen, where you're simultaneously aware of like your fucking, you know, thousands and thousands of incarnates. Like think about that. Like, okay, some of us are talking about enlightenment, this, you know, the non-dual teachers and all of it, but few of us actually have access to all these other multiple lived realities that are happening simultaneously. There's very few people that can even talk about that subject, right? So to me, in coming into the Keylonic stuff, that's where it opened me up to like a whole new level of humility, because I was like, okay, yeah, all these non-dualists are talking about like absolute maximum enlightenment, but to me, like, I see it as just like the beginning. It's like,
Bro,
you know what I mean?
I would really like to hear you talk about this with Frank.
Yeah, I think it's it's
That would be
inevitable.
an amazing conversation.
Yeah, we had it planned. We were gonna talk. We were gonna have to do a podcast, but it didn't line up. But then recently, when he did the most recent podcast with our brother there from Simulation, um he actually felt way more peaceful. I commented on the video on Instagram, and I messaged I can't believe I'm forgetting his name, our brother from Simulation. Um and I messaged him. I'm like, "Yo, it's a great podcast." And I commented. I'm like, Frank felt so much more peaceful, because it felt like he's like he's actually really integrating things in a more
You
way
got like
different way.
self-renowned stuff too.
Oh yeah. It's really cool. Actually, I really felt the difference, like from his initial few months after and compared to now. It's like, yeah, it really felt different. It was really cool. But yeah, I'd love to chat with him about it. And I know he's open to this, and I know he views actually a lot of these things similarly. It's just he uses a lot of very typical Buddhist terminologies, you know, which is actually really dope. Like, it's so adept in the way he communicates it. And it's taught me a lot of things, because I didn't actually get into Buddhism a lot like that. So it's fascinating to me. I started reading actually one of the books, what's it called? It's like it's the, I think it's the highest, they call it the highest teaching. It literally translates to the higher teachings of Buddha or Buddhism or whatever. And it's really complex actually. It's quite hard to understand, but it's what is fascinating about the Buddhist translations is similar to Keylonics, but and high level Hinduism is, or Yana is, the translations of those beings that were translating this were like, they're translating the scientific like blueprint of reality. Like the details of this one book, I got to get the name. I'll find the name, but it's so fascinating. Like, on one part of the book, like, it just came up to me, they were basically breaking down like the levels of laughter, for instance. Like if someone laughs with their mouth open and their face animated, it's much different than if they laugh with their mouth only slightly closed, versus when they only make small movements of their mouth, versus when they only make small sounds. Like, basically outlining like the levels of advancement in terms of consciousness, where like a being, their view was like a being who's maximally enlightened would laugh like with very little animation, because they're so absorbed in the consciousness, essentially. So they're basically outlining like every aspect of reality um in the most minute detail. Like, reading this book is, you're not really reading words, you're actually reading more like math. Like, it's hard to describe, but you're basically reading more math or like scientific formulas than you're reading like language explanations. Like, there's not many like actual explanations, although there's some. When you're reading some of those original like because it's read in like Sanskrit or like the original languages, so those languages are more mathematical, scientific than they are anything. So it's so fascinating to me, like, because, you know, when people think of spirituality, they think more of like qualitative, philosophical, you know what I mean? But then, like, anyone who's gone into Keylonics, the majority of the translations are scientific. It's extremely scientific and mechanical. It's not as much like these kind of like nice, like, you know, Muji sitting on the fucking thing talking about non-duality all day. You know what I mean? Like, even though like that's nice, it's not. It's an aspect to the path. It's not the only thing, right?